I'm McKinley Coda, and you're listening to the Pro PTN Podcast, an interview talk show for piano technicians to tune in to what the pros are talking about from across the industry. If you enjoyed today's episode, show us some love by following us on your podcasting platform and leaving us a review. To learn more about us here at the Professional Piano Technicians Network, visit us at proptn.org. Hello and welcome to the show. I am your host, McKinley Coda, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Arian Sheets, who is the curator of the Stringed Instrument Collection at the University of South Dakota's National Music Museum. With a collection of 14,000 instruments from the last 500 years, the university also offers a degree for historic instrument preservation that is the only terminal professional degree program of its kind in the country. Arian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Well, why don't you start us off by telling us about how you got started in your current position and where it has taken you over the years?
I started here full-time in 2001, but I got interested in historical musical instruments when I was in high school because I was a violinist at the time, and I thought, I spend all these hours with this thing stuck under my chin, and I don't know anything about its history, and that's just completely unacceptable. And I loved old things, so I really wanted to get a violin from the 1700s, and I succeeded in elementary school getting a violin built in 1799. So by 1 year, I made it in the 1700s. And,
oh my gosh.
I just started going to the library and reading, or like getting out of class to go to my high school library, which miraculously had a copy of the Grove Dictionary of Music, and just delved in. And then when I was in high school, I started looking at internships, and I had a couple family members who were involved in historical clarinets and historical keyboards, and they had told me about the National Music Museum, and I thought, this is this weird thing in South Dakota. I want to go there sometime. So finally in 1994, my parents took me down here, and I got to see the collection. I thought, wow, they have really old instruments. This is really cool. So I asked if they had internships, and the founding director, Andre Larson's like, I guess so. And so I wrote him a letter. This is back in the letter days. Wrote him a handwritten letter and was like, hey, can I come next summer and be an intern? And he's like, okay. So I stayed in his basement, and the projects that they had designed for me, I finished in a day what they thought I was going to take weeks to do. So I was just, gung-ho. And, at the time, so there was Andre Larson, the founding director. There was John Koster, who's a eminent scholar of historic keyboard instruments, Peggy Banks, who started off in historical strings and then went into American brass wind. And so I did that, and then I did an internship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I did an internship at Sotheby's in London, back when they still had auctions of historical musical instruments, so I did cataloging for them, and then at the Pitt Rivers and Bate collection in England. So actually I did a couple internships at the Metropolitan Museum of Art because I was actually thinking by the end of my time in college I wanted to go into musical instrument conservation and actually pursue formal training in art conservation. I was also working in the shop of Andrew Dipper, who is a historical instrument restorer and art restorer. And so I was working on everything from, old violins to mandolins to a Bugatti fire screen at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So he was doing art conservation at the time. But I was also going to Northwestern University for art history and music performance. And there I was able to do an ad hoc degree with viola, which was my instrument by that time in historical performance. So I played viola da gamba, viola, Baroque violin.
Wow.
I basically refused to focus or conform to anything. And I had no idea what I was going to do when I graduated. I was still thinking about conservation, but the programs to do that were just incredibly expensive, and it would have required a lot more schooling. But I was offered a job here at the museum unexpectedly, and I moved out, and I'm still here.
Yeah.
So I ended up staying on the curatorial side, but because of my technical background and my interest in technical things, I've also been involved in that. So yeah, that's how I got started. I was originally cataloging bowed stringed instruments, and then in around 2004, the director, Andre Larson, said, well, we really need somebody to do guitars. We're going to do a guitar gallery. How would you like to become an expert in guitars? And I'm like, oh, okay, sure. So I started researching, guitars, got into electric musical instruments, the early history of all kinds of electric instruments. We have an instrument called a chorale cello here, which was created between 1890 and about 1917. So it was one of the earliest electric instruments, and it actually is a keyboard instrument as well. So
Wow.
has a built-in piano. I was always interested in a lot of things, but there was always someone here who did keyboard instruments previously. So I had what I consider kind of a form of learned helplessness. I loved historical keyboards. I loved early pianos. I've got like literally thousands of recordings of people playing music on historical pianos. Ever since I heard Paul Badura play Beethoven on a Walter piano, I've been absolutely hooked.
Oh my
But I
gosh.
was always able to like go in the next room and like if I had a question, ask someone else or, not
Yeah.
have to actually know it myself. But then eventually everybody here who was an expert in keyboard instruments left. And, now that's not true because we've got Daryl Martin, who, as I
Hmm.
mentioned, our conservator has a background in harpsichord and clavichord building, and he's an expert in historical instruments from that period and earlier. But at the time, it's like, well, there's kind of a vacuum. Also, at the same time, is we had just done our building expansion, and we were originally expecting the donation of a Fazioli semi-grant for that. Well, the donor decided to sell it instead, and so we didn't have a piano for a new concert hall. And previously, the piano we had used for a concert hall, well, we had a Clavinova. We had a 1930s Wurlitzer spinet piano. That was simply because two staff members could move it. And then we had an 1855 Broadwood with an English action and a rather short compass, which, none of these are suitable to an actual concert hall. They're all
Right.
interesting instruments in their own right, but not for this purpose. So we're like, okay, what do? We need to get a piano in the concert hall. And, we were offered a used Steinway B from 2012 for 69,000, and I said, absolutely not. I can get a more interesting piano. I can get a better deal on it. That's too much money. It's not interesting enough. So, I opened my big fat mouth,
No,
and
I
so
love
then I
it. I
had to
love it.
make good on what I was saying I could do. So I started digging around and I started reaching out to contacts and just looking around at the market. And I did ultimately find 3 pianos to consider for our hall. One was a 1907 Steinway B with a Circassian walnut case. It was absolutely beautiful. 1890s art case Steinway D, which ended up being beyond the financial capacity of our donors.
Yeah, it
Um,
sounds like it.
and then a Mason and Hamlin CC from 1901. And I looked at the Mason Hamlin, I'm like, that's gigantic. That looks really cool. And of course, a Mason and Hamlin CC, it's 50% larger by mass than a Steinway D. It's a very big, very heavy piano. It was intimidating. I was like, oh God, is this going to fit on our stage? Is it,
Yeah.
what's going on with it? And of course, I wanted an instrument that could both be a good concert level playing instrument, but have quite a bit of originality to it. So it's not neither this nor that
Mm.
hybrid. So this piano, which belonged to Charlie Jackson of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, he's a collector and a piano technician. It had the original soundboard. It had been restored twice. It had a few things to do to kind of bring it more back to what it looked like originally, but it had potential. And at the same time, I also was, like I said, just reaching out to people. And when I was at Northwestern, I'd remembered going to the library and reading the alumni bulletin and seeing in there that, oh, Northwestern has a new piano technician. His name is Ken Ashtay, and he worked at the Smithsonian. He does historic instruments. And I remember thinking, oh, that's really cool. But at the time, I was just trying to get out of there, get my degree, get out of there. So I was kind of hiding under a rock a bit.
Yeah.
I remembered that he was there, and my last year there, my roommate and I actually acquired an 1860 Moussard upright from Paris originally that had been imported to San Francisco in the 1860s. And we had it delivered and needed it tuned. So I'm like, oh, there's Ken. I'll give him a call. He wasn't able to tune it, but he suggested someone else. And I thought, well, this guy, he was a really nice guy. He helped me out, even though he couldn't do the work, he found someone who was really good. And I thought, well, I'll just, I wonder where he is. So I saw, well, he's back in the United States. He'd gone to New Zealand. And so I sent him an email. And he wrote back. And I was like, oh, this is
Ah,
nice. And then he kept writing. And I thought, well, he's really interested in this. So we had more and more dialogues with Ken and kind of weighing different options. I presented these 3 pianos to our board. And they elected to go for the Mason and Hamlin because USD has 2 Steinway Ds. They've got a 1942 Steinway D that's been rebuilt and a 1971 Steinway D that's also been rebuilt by the Irwins in California. They did the new
nice.
soundboard and full rebuild on it.
Hmm.
So there's already a couple Steinway Ds on campus. The Mason and Hamlin provides something a bit different. But what ended up happening is, this is a big piano, it's a big investment, it's scary.
Yeah.
So we actually had Ken go out and look at it, and he sent some ominous things back about the condition. But then Daryl Martin, our conservator, and I had a call with him. And he's like, I think you should go for it.
Wow.
And so I arranged for the piano to get here at the same time as new hammers done by Jacob Irwin in conjunction with Ken, and Ken to get here. And all these things had to happen at the same time. So Ken installed these new hammers, did a full concert regulation, and this really wonderful sound started to come out of this piano.
Wow.
It was a huge risk. It ended up paying off. Ken voiced it to meet our smaller hall's needs. Even though it's this giant piano, it doesn't overpower the hall. And since then, we've had a bunch of wonderful work done by Tim Coates in Sioux Falls and also Joseph Lamour, who's now USD's piano technician. He took over from Tim when Tim was scaling back. And so we've got 2 wonderful piano techs who do great work with it as well. And so that's kind of how I got started, and I started
Wow.
researching all this stuff. I had a bunch of questions and, well, what was going on with this piano and how did it develop? And, there was kind of this mysterious apocryphal provenance that it had belonged to Harold Bauer, who was the pianist who was kind of introducing the Gertz redesigned concert grand, as part of his concert tour. So I started looking into that and I found all of this wonderful intrigue, this interesting model getting developed, how they were marketing it, all kinds of juicy things like an involuntary bankruptcy in 1904 that resulted in the acquisition by the cable company,
Yeah.
and all kinds of things about what it was like to tour back then, how companies were introducing new piano models using these concert tours. So ultimately, I thought, well, this has got a lot of story to it. So I'm actually working on a master's degree right now, and it's going to be about the Gertz redesigned instruments. And Mason and Hamlin have been absolutely wonderful. I've had access to the ledgers, so I'm really grateful to them. So, as I started looking into this, I was amazed that there were not an incredible amount of papers or books about the development of the modern piano. And it just shocked me because the world I came from with guitars and violins, there's been tons and tons of research and writing, but not about the piano.
Hmm.
And so many of the important developments that have resulted in the instrument that's widely used today occurred in America, particularly with the Chickering Company, obviously Steinway, but with others. And it was just a really fertile time. And so I saw, well, there's a lot to be done with this. There's a lot to look into. And also just looking back at, we ended up with a Mason and Hamlin CC. It's not a Steinway D. Okay, well, what were all the options out there? What was the tonal palette available at the time? The tonal palette has narrowed significantly. And looking at where things could go in the future, are there other ideas that are worth bringing back to the table? So that's kind of some of the things that intrigue me.
Yeah, I have so many questions. For starters, you said that the tonal palette has narrowed. Can you elaborate on that?
I'll give an example of Chickering. So Chickering of Boston was much bigger than Steinway in the mid 19th century. They had been around since the 1820s, and many of the aspects of the modern piano actually originated with them, including the full cast iron plate for grands, which was introduced well, patented in 1843, full cast iron plate for squares, patented in 1840, and all kinds of experimental designs. They also worked with Washburn for the development of American-made steel piano strings. So there's all this kind of technological stuff happening. Now, Chickering, as many of the techs listening to this know, every Chickering you dig into it, you never know what you're going to find because they're a really experimental company. And
Yeah.
so they'll have certain scales, which are, basic designs, but there's even variation within that. And they would offer pianos of incredibly different designs all at the same time. So they'll have, concert grands of multiple completely different conceptions available, in the same year. Then you've got Steinway that was really kind of focusing in on one version of things. And ultimately, the Steinway sound has become absolutely predominant. And other makers make instruments to sound closer to Steinways. But if you look at the pianos that were available in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there were a lot of different sounds available. And
Mm.
I think that the modern piano it's a fantastic instrument. The Steinway sound is fantastic. We've got an 1867 Steinway concert grand that sounds like a Steinway concert grand.
Yeah.
And what I like to say when I'm showing people that instrument, I said, it's not that this piano sounds way more modern than the others. It's that the modern piano sounds like this Steinway concert grand. And when you
Right.
hear other instruments against it, you can hear how different it is and how interesting it is. But I think there is something lost when the sound palette becomes too narrowed. And there are other makers trying to do different things. Obviously, Mason and Hamlin
Right.
is one. They create a wonderful modern piano, but it does have a different sound quality. You've got experiments with doing straight strung instruments again.
Hmm.
And so part of where I see the museum coming in is providing access, essentially musical instruments as primary sources. Go and get ideas. There are lots of ideas sitting out there that may have been tried and then fell
Yeah.
by the wayside, but they're out there and maybe some of them are good. Maybe some of them have legs for modern pianos.
Okay, so another question I had is you were talking about all the recordings that you listened to of all these different voicings and examples of sound, and you loved the Beethoven one specifically. At least that was the first one that you listened to. Do you have any favorite examples of strange voicings or strange tonal palettes on an instrument?
There is one recording that, and this comes out of my research. I had the recording, but I hadn't really paid attention. I was really curious because I was looking into the history of the American piano, and one issue that came up was pitch. So you've got people creating scalings and designing instruments, but pitch at A440 wasn't really widely adopted until the 20th century. Before that, you had the New York piano manufacturers adopting A435, which you'll see on some pianos in 1891. But prior to that, the American piano makers and many piano makers around the world were using what we now call high pitch. So this could be as high as A460, usually in the 450s or so. And so I was like, well, obviously it's scary to crank up, a historical piano to that, but I did find one recording that was done at the old Finchcocks on an 1849 Broadwood grand piano, or 1859, I'm sorry. And they recorded some Mendelssohn at one of the high pitches somewhere in the A450s. And interestingly, this piano, there's actually recordings of it on YouTube, the same piano at modern pitch, and it sounds like a different instrument. And that really intrigued me. There was much more clarity and a different sound quality at the higher pitch. Unfortunately, this recording at high pitches is out of print. It was on the old Amon-Ra Finchcock's label, but
Yeah.
that really stood out to me as something particularly interesting and something that is more accessible if people want to hear a wider variety and see a wider variety of instruments is the Frederick collection in Ashburn in Massachusetts. The Fredericks have a wonderful program there, And they do concerts just about every week during their season, and they have been putting videos on YouTube of the concerts, and not nearly enough people are watching these videos. So all of you go out and watch these
Oh
videos
my
because
gosh.
they're absolutely wonderful.
Yes, that's such a good tip.
So that collection is specifically a playing collection, and Mike Frederick has developed this incredible skill at voicing and regulating historical instruments and meeting them where they're at, preserving as much original material as possible, but still making these things sound absolutely amazing.
Wow.
And if you go there and visit, it's really fun because Mike will play for you and he'll play really softly. And I'm like, that's the ultimate piano technician's flex. You know, he'll just play
Yes,
incredibly softly and
yes.
it'll just speak beautifully and have a wonderful tone and be very even and fluid. I highly recommend visits to them and also going and checking out their YouTube channel. I always love it when they post new videos, so it's fun to see those concerts.
Can you tell us what the YouTube channel is called or where we can find those?
It's the Frederick Collection, so I just usually will search Frederick Collection YouTube and piano, and the instruments will be up there. So,
Awesome.
and they do have, it's not all super early instruments. I mean, they do have some 20th century instruments that make the series as well.
I'm going to add a link to that in the show notes for all the listeners at home. Now, what does the average project look like for you, and what kind of jobs might you see within a given month?
As I've been here longer, I've become useful in many ways.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's a mix of internal work and external work. So internal work might include cataloging instruments or archives, keeping paperwork up to date, tuning instruments. But then external work might involve either research inquiries or visiting researchers, tours, things like that. So usually the most urgent thing is the public facing side, so that often will take precedent, but it's kind of a mix of both of those things.
Now, what are some of the biggest misconceptions you have encountered concerning the museum's collection or historic instruments as a whole?
Well, one that always bemused me, and I've certainly worked to change this perception, is that when instruments go in a museum, they're imprisoned there. They're behind a glass case. That's where they go to die. That there's cobwebs and no one cares, and it's
Yeah.
very sad. And that's maybe true of some older institutions or some older mentalities, but museums now, historical collections, especially in the US, speaking of our institution, our colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, our colleagues at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, we're all very, very open to research, to having certain instruments kept in playing condition. And all of that's just going to depend on what the needs and circumstances are. So we do have playing instruments. We do have instruments that are reserved exclusively for archival purposes that it's really not realistic to restore. And, we provide access to a lot of different constituencies. So we've got the general visitor, we've got what I call enthusiasts, people who might have 5 guitars and a piano and they love playing music, but they're not a professional. We've got researchers
Hmm.
who are doing more academic work. We've got performers who just are gearheads. They love to come and see cool instruments. Maybe they want to try some. People coming here and doing recordings. We have a concert series, so we've got a mix of people playing their own instruments, people playing museum instruments. We're also at a university. We're becoming much closer since we've got our new facilities with our music department and College of Arts and Sciences. And so we've got instruments that students can come over and do their recitals on. I mentioned the Mason and Hamlin CC from 1901. That's open for use for that. We also have a collection generously donated by Ken Cancelosi of bowed stringed instruments, including really, really valuable Cremonese cello by Ruggieri from 1683, so that little old undergrads here at University of South Dakota can come over and play really world-class instruments in the museum, practice on them, play their recitals on them. That's not going to include all the instruments. We've got instruments that are reserved only for very seldom use, if ever, because of the condition or the rarity or whatever. But we also have different scales for different purposes. And
Hmm.
so, we're really working on making sure that there's a variety of access points for different interest levels, different knowledge levels. Like I mentioned, we do tours, we've got school tours, we've got individual tours, we've had families come in and want tours, or sometimes people will come in and then they'll mention at the front desk, oh, like just today I was downstairs, there was a homeschool group of homeschool kids and they're all learning piano, really big family,
Yeah.
and they asked, can we try the Mason and Hamlin? And I'm like,
Oh my
sure.
gosh.
So I came down and got to hear some chorales on the Mason Hamlin and a young guy playing, probably his own music, improvisation, beautiful playing. That's always a treat to me. So when you talk
Wow.
about what an average day is, I didn't expect
Yeah.
that, but it was a really nice treat this morning.
Yeah. And what a transformative experience for them as well. That must have been really special.
That's what I hope is when the kids come and they get these experiences that they grow up and they have a fond experience of the museum, that it didn't feel intimidating. They felt welcomed, that historical instruments are for them, the museum's for them. And that's, what makes us tick.
That's beautiful.
What's the point in saving all these things if it's not to put smiles on faces and to preserve the history for future generations so that they can have as much fun being dorks as we are having?
I love it. I love it. And speaking of nerding out, are there any areas of intrigue or research that you're particularly excited about taking place in the museum, or any areas of research that you've been diving into recently that are really lighting your fire?
Well, I mentioned my looking into the early Mason and Hamlin. That's kind of fun and unexpected. Another line of inquiry we're looking at, and we've been working with Ken Eshte on this, is the idea of how do we help historical instruments survive? And while the museum is a great place for something that maybe isn't feasible to make playable, pianos suffer from the fact that they're big and they're heavy and they take up a lot of room in people's houses. And if they can't be made playable, they run the risk of being destroyed. And while, the instruments I mentioned that Daryl Martin, our conservator, made, harpsichords, clavichords, there's no industrial processes in them that it isn't possible for somebody who's really determined and has hand skills that they can just make one just like it. Once you get into iron casting and, the kind of instruments you see starting from the 1830s, 40s on, those instruments are really not able to be made by just anybody. They require a lot of expense, a lot of industrial processes. Every single one of those instruments that goes to the dump is lost forever. And that is an urgency that I feel very strongly about. But at the same time, there are different levels of restoration, there are different levels of rebuilding. And the modern concept of rebuilding, where you basically just remanufacture the piano, is fantastic for some purposes, but it's not economically feasible or advisable for every single instance. And so where you see, maybe somebody with an 1860s, 1870s Chickering Grand, and they call someone in, they're like, oh, this thing needs a $60,000 rebuild, and the family, can't afford it. Okay, so how do we meet that piano where it's at? How do we help those clients be able to keep their family heirloom and play it, but without those level of expenses? And so one interesting project we worked on with Ken Eshte was our 1864 Chickering Scale 19, which is their semi-grand, has fantastic sonic potential. It's a beautifully made piano, but it had 3 different cracks in 3 different struts at the nose bolts. And in the real world, that's a death sentence, right? And, there's different ways that people have addressed this. Obviously metal stitching is one of them. But where these cracks were, it was really small area, and it's not clear that the metal stitching would really solve the technical problem, which is that part of the strut needs to resist upward bowing pressure. So Ken came up with a solution that is reversible and relatively inexpensive. So he had T4 tool steel plates made by a machinist friend of his. There were drill holes put into and that was the only part of the original material that was lost, drill holes put in the struts, and the plates were bolted over those areas. So cosmetically, it's not as pretty as if you simply put metal stitching and then finished it out and everything. But it was an experiment to see, for a few $1,000s, can you take a piano off death row and make it able to get up to 440? And it worked. He brought the piano up to
Wow.
tension and there was zero movement. And so it's kind of looking at innovative ways to save historic instruments, save the wallets of the clients, and
Yeah.
everybody's going to be happier for that. So stuff like that is what lights a fire, those kind of collaborations, real world stuff, and so
Yeah.
we used our Scale 19 as kind of a test case. So it's not just interesting as a historical instrument, but also for what can be done to save others like it.
As far as the plate repair went, did you notice it affect the sound in a dramatic way, or did you notice any big changes?
No, but part of that is actually we're going to have Ken back this year, and he's going to finish more of the restoration. We're looking at, figuring out the stringing scale right now. It's going to have to be restrung. We also worked with the South Dakota School of Mines, which is in the state university system, on metallurgy, looking at the composition of the strings that are on it, which are likely from an early restring in the 19th century.
Oh, cool.
We're not going to be able to reproduce exactly what those strings are, but we're going to take that into account when looking at the restringing. So the piano was quite low before that, so it's a bit hard to judge. But the piano has a fantastic sound. It is incredibly powerful. It is very bright. It's like a sparkling white wine, I mean, an acidic white wine. I mean, it's just a
Wow.
sparkly instrument. And I think it's going to be a great instrument for performers once we get it to the level that it can, have tuning stability and all that.
Oh, so cool. Hi there, this is McKinley from the editing room, here to remind you that if you have not already signed up for a ProPTN subscription, you're seriously missing out. Whether you need articles from our Beginner's Corner to help supplement your students' education, or if you're a seasoned tech who wants a refresher on certain specialty skills, ProPTN has got you covered with peer-reviewed editorial content, video demonstrations, and photographed step-by-step instructionals. On top of that, the collection is our online marketplace that is a must for maintaining your tool collection. If you want to try a tuning lever before you buy it, you can check out our rent-a-lever program. If you make and design your own tools, you can sign up to distribute them through the collection. If you're a retiring technician, we can sell your tool collection on consignment. Or you can just go shopping for a whole selection of new and used tools from brands and technicians you trust. So what are you waiting for? Go sign up now and you'll thank me later. Anyways, back to the show. So, as piano technicians, we're frequently approached by clients who want to believe that their crummy old pianos are historically valuable. And I sometimes get the sneaking concern that I may accidentally condemn something that actually has value, as you mentioned before. So, what are the absolute basics for identifying whether an instrument is historically significant or valuable, and what should a technician do if they come across one?
That's a really hard question because when you get a neglected piano call, you have to brace
Mm-hmm.
yourself. You don't know what you're going to
Yeah.
encounter. And your brains are full with, how am I going to get this working for the client? What do I tell the client? What am I expecting? What am I going to find when I try to start tuning the thing? So I understand there's a lot of brain space that's devoted to that. I think if you see something that's really unusual or interesting, or if it appears to be particularly early, I think one of the areas of historical instruments that are neglected is, when did the firsts of different things come in? And I'll give an example of a Decker upright that we have in the museum. And it had been on the deaccessioning chopping block a couple of times in the past because, we don't just collect run of the mill American uprights. There's a million of them,
Mm-hmm.
we get them offered all the
Yeah.
time. They have to be unique or interesting or special in some way to justify their place here. And this Decker upright, well, it looks like an American upright. It's got American upright action. It's got
Yeah.
88
Yeah.
keys. But here's the clincher. It's from 1869. It's really, 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 really early. And 88 notes, otherwise looks like an American upright. This is
Yeah.
right at the beginning of when this model came in. And it appears that there are different factors involved for this type of instrument to develop. Part of it was the New York manufacturers. There were companies, Straub, making upright actions specifically. Straub specialized in upright actions. So those were available to manufacturers. There were a variety of influences from German uprights, which were very progressive for the time. And this is true of a lot of instruments, everything from mellophones to upright pianos. When the new instrument came out, was developed, the American upright, it was actually not the cheap instrument that you think of today, oh God, another upright. It was actually a premium product. These were big instruments that were quite expensive, would often have, 88 note compasses, and they were being sold to particular markets as premium pianos. And it wasn't until the mid 1870s and you got more of the mass production copying these previously premium instruments that you then really start getting the floodgates open. Then when you've got the mass production, you start getting lower quality instruments. And
Mm.
so then the brand of the upright piano gets tarnished and it's like, oh God, another one of these things. But originally
Mm.
it was a quite innovative high-end product. I would say probably the same is true of the American square piano. By the end of the century, you've got people having piano bonfires of square pianos because they want to promote everybody throwing them away and buying uprights.
Yeah.
But so many of the innovations, like I mentioned, the full frame came first in the American Square. And then the American Square became a more accessible, commoditized product. There were cheaper examples made, and then the cheaper examples kind of flooded the market, and then the good ones got,
Yeah.
sort of tarnished by that. And so if you don't really know, does it appear particularly early for the characteristics it has? Is it there's something particularly novel about it? And also, is it by a really good, reputable manufacturer? Always give something a second look. If it's a Blutner, if it's a Steinway, if it's a Chickering, something like that, because good quality instruments have something to work with and might be better for preservation. They might have more innovative features, and I think this is one of the hard points that, we sort of talked a little bit in advance, is how much of a historical design makes you cringe because it's 120 years old, but
Right.
it's well made, and how much of it is that it's a bad design or a bad piano and it's falling apart. That, an instrument with good quality materials that's structurally solid always has something to work with. Now, the client may not have enough money to really bring it back to a full modern standard, but it's always worth looking at, can I meet the client and the piano where they are? Well, I'll give an example. I just went out with Joseph Lamore, who's USD's technician, on a job in this area of a Weber Square from the mid 1860s. And this is a piano that had been in the family since 1912. The current owner had hoped all of her life that she would eventually end up with it. It's had some restoration in the past, but, it needs a lot of work. And she was willing to invest in it. So she had us come up. We didn't know what we were going to expect. There's going to be some interesting repairs that have to be done to the action, but she's perfectly happy to have this work done to pay for it. If somebody came in there and said, your piano's a hunk of junk, it doesn't play well, throw it away, that would be really sad. She wants to get the work done. She's not afraid of spending the money.
Mm-hmm.
Make her happy. And we got it incremental process. It's better than it was.
Yeah.
She knows it's never going to be as good as a fully modern piano, but it's what she wants, and it's what she wants to spend her money on. And if you've got an open mind and you're willing to be curious and take things apart and go, oh gosh, how does that work? How can I get this to work again? I think that goes a long way. And I think with any task, an important thing to keep in mind is whether or not it's a burden and something horrible has to do with the mentality someone goes in with it. And if you decide this is an ordeal, it's going to be an ordeal. If you simply say, one step at a time, here are the motions, you do one motion after another, it's not an ordeal. And so it's really going to depend on the instrument, the client. Are they, happy to spend the money? Do they have realistic expectations? Then it's worth going ahead and, putting smiles on people's faces is what this is about. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking musical instruments here. no one is going to die if somebody doesn't have a piano or does have a piano or it's working perfectly or it's not. I mean, I know some pianists can get a little dramatic and it can feel like that, but really, ultimately, music is for our pleasure and it should bring joy, and approaching problems with creativity, curiosity, and the desire to serve, I think goes a long way to having good experiences.
As far as what technicians should do when they come across a historic instrument like that, I want to tie it into a question that was asked by Morgan Cowell, who's a colleague of ProPTN who tipped us off about your museum back in March. He said, your shop specializes in rebuilding instruments without doing invasive restoration, which is what a lot of rebuilding shops do, which is replacing the soundboard, bridges, pin block, etc. Can you tell us about your process for that, and what are some of the unintended consequences or dangers of invasive restorations?
There's really like a chart that you could think of. So there's the idea of preserving as much original material as possible, and then there's the idea of invasive versus less invasive. So they're not necessarily the same thing. We did a restoration just this last month that was a soundboard off restoration of a 1784 Spaten small Tangentenflügel. So this is a tangent piano, 18th century tangent piano.
Oh my
It
gosh.
had several cracks in the soundboard. It was apparent that the ribs on the underside had come loose. So soundboard had to come out for it to be restored. That's very invasive. However, we didn't remove original material as best we could. So, it was not, we kept as much original material, but it was highly invasive. And there are also, restorers out there doing absolutely amazing things with recrowning soundboards. So they basically take the piano completely apart. They will essentially remanufacture the soundboard using the original materials plus adding to compensate for whatever shrinkage there is to recrown the soundboard. Again, original materials, however, very invasive. And I think it really is going to depend on the circumstances. I was very fortunate to get to visit Jude Reveley's shop in Lowell, Massachusetts. He was
Yeah.
very, very gracious, really amazing shop, wonderful person. He does in a lot of ways the opposite of approach of what a museum does, but it has a functionality to it. And Jude said, yeah, what I do is remanufacturing. So he
Mm.
takes an instrument and essentially hot rods it and makes, kind of a hybrid out of it. Now, this isn't the museum approach. However, a lot of the pianos that he's working with would literally go to the dump
Mm.
if he wasn't remanufacturing, because there are clients that need an instrument that performs as well as a modern instrument, and he is saving so much valuable material from being wasted. So there's the aspect of, okay, fidelity to the original conception versus, providing what the client needs. So I think where I draw the line is if it's a standard production instrument, of which there are many, and it's in line to be discarded because it no longer fits the needs of the players or the owners, it's much better to have an invasive restoration, remanufacturing, than it is to throw it away.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're never getting back those old growth woods. It's just absolutely distasteful to think of this beautiful material rotting somewhere. So yes, if we're looking at recycling and reusing, it's important that things get rebuilt in that manner. I think where I'd say it's not appropriate to do that is for an instrument that is particularly historic, particularly unique, particularly early. If you're looking at an instrument from the 1860s or earlier, it's going to be pretty different than a modern instrument. Barring the idea that, the soundboard's a complete wreck and it's literally not savable, and that happens.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that this is not a fully modern piano and not trying to bring it to that standard might be an advisable approach. But, there is no black and white. There are no single answers for that. But I think where the danger comes in with instruments that start diverging much more from what we expect of a piano today is that these instruments were designed by incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly astute people, and they were systems. So if you don't understand the system, and you just make changes without fully understanding how the whole thing works together, you can really get yourself in trouble. And this can do with, changing a Brown action to a modern Erard action, anything like that, where you're just going in like a bulldozer and modifying it
Mm.
without understanding how it was supposed to function. If there's something you see that you don't understand, take a step back, don't do anything. you know, Try to figure out what's going on before you
Yeah,
go in like a bulldozer and, really mess something up.
right.
And I think you'll see this sometimes, when people put hammers on that aren't the right weights, and then all of a sudden the whole thing
Mm.
doesn't work right.
Yeah, yeah,
So, pay attention, be curious, and you're less
yeah.
likely to get yourself in trouble.
So, as far as who they would contact if they run into that issue, is there a platform or a resource or a directory of experts they could consult with, or is it just up to the individual to know who in their area could be the resource when they have the questions, or should they just email you?
I mean, anybody is always welcome to email me. I'm really
Awesome.
happy to talk to people. Another great person to be in touch with is Bill Scholl. He is both a restorer, he has the Period Piano Center in California, so he's got quite a few historic instruments under his care. And he's really made it a mission to help document these things. He does also do work on historic instruments, so he can advise from that perspective. I mentioned that we work with Ken Eshtay, who's incredibly creative with
Mm.
solving problems of historic instruments. So those are just a few people, and I'm always happy to refer people to others, if they need help.
Well, another question from Morgan. He says that they sometimes struggle to make quality repairs on instruments with all the modern amenities like power tools and electricity. Go back 200, 300 years. How long did it take to construct the average stringed instrument? What was the apprenticeship process like? What were the tools like? How did they differ?
It's going to be drastically different depending on the time period you're looking at. So, if you're just looking at the Industrial Revolution, one of the first complex products made as a standardized commodity were actually early pianos in London. So the Broadwood Company, some of the manufacturers there, where you had very standardized instruments being made on a large scale. Obviously a lot of that was being done with handwork at the time, but you'd have specialization. So you'd have workers that would specialize in one task, division of labor, and they'd become very good at it, and they'd often be paid by the piece. So it was in their incentive to become very fast at it. I
Mm.
don't know of any actual studies of how long it took to build things because these were being made, often a factory or workshop setting. Things are being done in batches. There were essentially assembly lines even going back to the 16th century with like the Ruckers
Mm.
family had a big workshop. Lute makers in Italy had huge workshops with incredible amounts of production. So people quickly figured out ways to produce things accurately quickly, but how much time did each individual task take? How much did certain parts of it sit around and wait for the next part? I can't answer those questions. When you get to the 19th century, you start having steam power in plants, so you would potentially have machine tools for turning metal parts, for machining wooden parts. So there definitely was machinery in the 19th century with a lot of these instruments, but these people also just had incredible facility with the handwork. And particularly in the mid 19th century, the quality of the workmanship was just incredible. Looking at our 1864 Chickering scale 19, the joinery, just the little details are just incredible. But we've got a Chickering scale 95 from 1884, and already when you pull the action out of that, the internal work is not nearly as precise or refined as that 1860s
Mm.
instrument. And I don't really know why. We have a Schiedmeyer piano from 1860, a grand piano. Again, just the joinery, the hand skill. Oh my gosh, these people were masters, but they could work incredibly quickly. So I think if you took a piano builder from the mid 19th century and plopped them in a shop today, I think everybody's jaws would drop. at how well they could operate
Yeah.
hand tools. And we have the blessing and the curse of modern power tools that it's just different. And in order to have that level of facility, you just have to be doing it lots and lots and lots of hours.
Now, despite how much we may currently know about historic instruments, are there any baffling or mysterious examples of stringed instrument design that we don't fully understand?
Like I mentioned, understanding instruments as systems, every example is potentially kind of reverse archaeology, figuring out, what were they thinking? What were their goals?
Yeah.
Because objects are primary sources. They're as much a primary source as a book is, or a piece of archival material. There is a dialogue that you have when you start examining a historical object and you're figuring out how is it made, how does it work, what remainders of tool marks are you seeing. You get an idea of people's personalities. You can speculate as to what their goals are, but a lot of that still remains shrouded in mystery. Even a really well restored mid 19th century piano, we can hear it, we can play it, we can figure out how the action works and everything. But what we can't necessarily know is what were their goals? How was this instrument succeeding or not succeeding from the maker designer's goals? And so that's always a continual source of exploration. And then you mix it in with, I've looked back through historical sources saying, what were perceptions of things? How was sound described? What was the chatter about when you go to the music trade review? What were they talking about? And the Music Trade Review, which is actually online, you can go and look at old issues, and it's like sitting in a back room spying on people. It's really fun. It's great if you're nosy,
Yeah.
because they'll sit there and they'll argue, certain topics that, everybody will just be yakking away at them, and then it moves on to something else. I mean, people are people, and they argue and
Yeah.
they insult each other and they do all kinds of crazy things. So you can look at the object as it is, but then trying to unravel what people's motivations or goals are is kind of the next level. Like, what's going on here? What were they trying to do?
Yeah. Do you have any favorite historic instruments in the collection, and why are they your favorite?
I've got lots of favorites. This is a problem. I mean, obviously, I love the Mason and Hamlin CC.
You were involved in that one much
Yeah,
more
we took
hands-on,
a
yeah.
huge risk to bring this piano here because of its age, its size, and pianists love it. They really love it.
Wow.
And it was a lot of work to put all the pieces together, and a lot of people helped along the way. It was a real team effort, and when I can sit down in that concert hall and hear musicians play it and hear these wonderful sounds come out, I think this is all worth it. This thing hopefully will be making people smile long after I'm
Oh
gone.
my gosh.
And instruments I brought here that have potential, for performance, for research, that, I'm trying to set up lines of inquiry so that future grad students or future curators or future outside researchers have the resources they need with what I can save now, that 100 years from now, when things are much rarer, they have important things. And then, going back to my string days, we've got a viola here. It's by Nicola Bergonzi from 1781. And it was an instrument that is in, very, very original condition. The funding was a generous gift from the widow of a collector whose collection is here. And, she wanted it to be preserved so it wouldn't get modernized and, would be kept in this great condition. We actually had it performed for the first time in the museum in 2005 for a special event we were having. And I go, oh my gosh, this viola has a lot of potential. So I started steering makers who would come to visit who were looking to copy historical instruments. I said, you've got to try this thing. Visually, acoustically, everything had a lot of potential for what players need today. And there are tons of little baby Bergonzis out there. Some of them have been scaled up, some of them have been scaled down. But there's
Oh
lots of
my gosh.
musicians out there playing new instruments by talented modern makers that were inspired or got information from this viola in the museum. And the example here is seldom played because of its purity and its condition and everything, but it's got babies everywhere. It's like
Oh
a
my
cloned
gosh.
cutting, out there. And, I'm talking about a couple of old instruments, but I love modern instruments. This institution and me personally have great relationships with modern makers and restorers. We're
Yeah.
hosting instrument making workshops here. This year we've got Marilyn Wallen, very, very gifted maker and a violist originally, doing a workshop on viola making. So last summer we had a group of violin and bow makers. So there were several bows that were born in Vermilion, South Dakota, based copies of things that are here in our collection. Multiple people can't own any particular historic instrument here, but they can own the copies of it. Now,
Yes.
as I was saying
Yes.
before, that doesn't work quite so well for some of the later historical pianos. But if we can
Yeah.
provide the resources for potential restoration or things like that, that helps its siblings, continue to survive.
Now, this is a far more inelegant question, but have you come across an instrument where you thought, this is it, this is the stupidest instrument design I've ever seen in my life?
I'm going to use an example that's intentionally stupid and fantastic as a result. We have a zither made out of a fertilizer spreader, probably from the 30s. It's like a folk art piece. We have a stringed instrument, I don't know if I'd call it a guitar, that's the body is a hubcap from the 70s. We have ridiculous things, and they're great.
Yeah.
Endless, cigar box instruments, people just having fun. And of course it's ridiculous, but they know that.
Yeah.
Or they don't have financial access to professionally made instruments. So they make what they need to make to have the human experience of playing a musical instrument.
There is a guitarist from Mali who I absolutely love, and he was hired to play Prince in the Mullion remake of Purple Rain. But he first got discovered by a guy from Portland because he was so captivated by rock and roll radios that he heard traveling through his Tuareg village that he made a guitar out of bicycle spokes.
Hmm.
And some guy heard him playing and was like, "You need a guitar." And he sent him a left handed Fender, and he's now touring all over the world. And that's such a great example. I also feel like zithers are always the cheapest. When I was working in an instrument shop, zithers were always like yeah, whatever, throw them out for $10, whatever. So I even like seeing that they can be made organically so that they're not quite so sort of cheap. And that's a great answer.
Yeah, and the whole zither phenomenon, I've been involved in a lot of this American fretless zither research, and that's its whole own phenomenon related to door-to-door sales, mass marketing, things like that. I
Oh
mean,
my gosh, I can only imagine. That must be a lot.
and yet there are some really incredible music that can be made with them too. I mean, the whole point was to be accessible. They're cheap. Yes, they're cheaply made, but they're cheap. They would often come with these little charts where people could make their own music, and you had people going door to door and selling them. Hey, for $20, but I'll give you a special deal. Pay,
Yeah, yeah.
this installment thing, and.
I was always captivated by all the hybrids that were made out of zithers. You have like violin zithers, guitar zithers, and all these strange amalgamations that all kind of work the same way. I once played I don't know if they called it a via zither or a viola zither or something like that, but you bowed the edges and played the strings that were in the middle. It struck me as genius. It was such a cool instrument. Now, is there a piano or harpsichord specific design that you ever thought was the absolute worst idea?
I think the things that are on the list of things that make me disgruntled is anything that makes it difficult to be restored or repaired.
Amen.
So one of the things that just makes me shake my head are captured plates where you can't get the plate out of the piano. And Chickering was guilty of this. Pianos where the pin block is set into the sides,
Yep.
it's just a complete pain in the butt. Or, action parts for spinets that are made of plastic that disintegrate,
Yeah.
Anything that was not intended to be repaired or they don't think about the technician servicing it, those are things that are just a complete pain. But at the same time, stepping back, okay, so why would Chickering make an instrument where you can't get the plate out because you can't repair it? Think about how fast the piano was changing in this time and what the financial incentives for the manufacturers were. They were not looking at making pianos that could be rebuilt 10 times
Yeah.
because they figured, oh, there's going to be a new design, a better model coming along.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And it's only been since the piano has stopped progressing so fast that we've really looked at, okay, how are we going to fully rebuild and remanufacture something that was made 100 years ago? And also just the whole concept of how restorations are done or rebuildings are done, that's talking about things that haven't really been fully explored, is looking at what examples are there of how were people servicing older instruments in the past? What kind of work was being done? Looking at the history of repair. And I think when you start getting people seriously looking at, how do I service this thing over a longer period, then you start seeing more repairable designs.
Hmm.
I also might add that part of the concert grand today or a semi-grand today by a good manufacturer is colossally expensive. I mean, I'd say as much as a house, but housing prices have gone crazy. But literally, for a long time, as much as a house. If you look at what concert grands were going for, even in the first half of the 20th century, adjusted for inflation, they were much cheaper then than they are now, a lot cheaper. And so it was really much more feasible to just replace instruments rather than rebuild them. And so I haven't really fully explored that, but it's going to be really hard to document. It's going to be really hard to find sources because a lot of it just never got written down.
Yeah. With such insight into how instruments have evolved over the last few centuries, have you ever imagined what some of the exciting new instruments of the future might look like? Any designs that might call back to historic ideas or perhaps abandon them altogether? Or have you yourself ever enjoyed daydreaming about how you might create your own unique instrumental adaptations?
I'm a bit too lazy to think of inventing something from scratch myself. But part of
Yeah.
the idea of drawing from the past to look at ideas for the future is looking at, okay, what kind of things were being tried? What kind of sounds were coming of instruments? Does this have relevance now? How can it be adapted to modern needs? We've had a number of examples of people creating new pattern straight strung instruments. I think those are really interesting. There's one in particular that is my favorite. It's the Arno piano. And I believe the only example of it is in Michigan, but there are actually sound clips on Arno Patton's website, and it is luscious. It sounds amazing.
Wow.
And it's a
Okay.
very, very modernistic, beautiful case design. It's an unconventional design, drawing partially on the past, but it absolutely will suit modern player needs. So I think kind of hybridizing things, exploring different ideas. It gets harder when you're in pianos where it costs so much. I talked about how it's really not feasible for someone to make a reproduction of a mid 19th century American grand piano because of all these industrial
Yeah.
things. It gets much harder for people in the piano world to be able to explore these ideas. But I am very happy when I see people trying things, going way out of pocket to at least give it a
Yeah.
shot.
Yeah.
And then obviously, I think a lot of newer instrument design is going to come from the software field. This
Mm.
has been really something that has confused the concept of organology or the study categorization of musical instruments. When is software a musical instrument? I believe software absolutely can be a musical instrument.
Hmm.
And you basically have the severing of the physicality of an instrument from its sound generation and its hardware and the interface. So you've got much more flexibility. But from a museum perspective, preserving that is going to become much more difficult. The analog age is easier to preserve. It's easier to preserve a violin from the 1500s than it is to preserve a instrument made from modern materials or a software bound and computer hardware bound thing.
Yeah.
So as hard as it would be to reproduce a 19th century piano with an iron frame, it's even harder to produce an analog synthesizer made from parts that no longer exist, or even early digital instruments with chips that are no longer manufactured. Or, one of my projects was trying to get a 1980s period MIDI setup going, including with original computer hardware. And I haven't actually gotten it fully set up, but I do have, some of the hardware involved. I don't know if I can really get it going.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because earlier you were talking about how you were also doing research in early electronic instruments. And I think you set a pretty early date that was involved with that. I mean, what are some of the earliest electronic instruments? What did they look like? What was your research unfolding?
So this chorale solo I mentioned, the research for it started in the 19th century. So as soon as people were harnessing electricity. They were trying to create music with it. And this was before the age of electronic amplification. So how the chorale solo worked was it would have a DC current that then went through an interrupter. So it was like a rheotome where it would have either discs or cylinders with alternating conducting and non-conducting sections. And these would rotate, and there were wire brushes that would go across them, so they would create an on-off DC pulse at particular frequencies, 440, 880, whatever.
Right, right.
That electrical pulse would get routed through a controller, which was basically an organ console or a piano console, and then go to electromagnets that were mounted over piano strings or over metal bars or things like that. And then when the pulse would come on, it would pull the metallic element toward it, and when it would go off, it'd release it. So it would induce a vibration.
Wow.
There are actually some sound clips of this instrument back when there were examples that were running, and it's been kind of reinvented. There are more modern versions of it that function essentially in the same way. So, and some of the versions are actually units that can mount over a modern grand piano and actually get this kind of ethereal sound, humming sound, while also playing it in a conventional way. So talk about historical things. So you didn't have electronic amplification, so it essentially went the other way around. You have acoustical production of the sound using electricity, but this was outdated once you had electronic amplification, and you could take a small electronic signal of some kind and amplify it. But it's been reinvented because why not? And I'm not sure the inventors even knew that it had already been invented, but somebody was trying something out, so.
That's so cool. That's so cool. To wrap us up, can you tell us about your favorite part of the industry as well as your favorite tool?
My favorite part of the industry is meeting fellow people who love to get down into details and really like nerdy things, and you start having conversations about how various mechanical things work with most people, and it's like their eyes are going to glaze over.
Their eyes glaze over.
But it's sort of like you talk to people and they're like, well, I could really bore you with this, and they're trying to give you an out to say, oh yeah, that's too technical, and I'm like, no, more please.
Yeah.
It's sort of like a safe space for those of us who love details and love to figure out how things work and take things apart and put them back together. As far as tools are concerned, I had this conversation, I think, with Morgan, and it was like tools that are binkies, like that you just absolutely love and rely on, but they're complete garbage. And if you die, it'd be the first thing somebody's going to chuck out when they're cleaning out your stuff.
Yeah.
As a curator, I've got this like ratty old piece of measuring tape that has been cut off, and it's just the one I've used for years. It's really familiar. So curatorially, that's my binky. When I was working in the restoration shop, the shop I work for, Andrew Dipper, he does a lot of work with scrapers. And so he had scrapers of all different kinds. They're fantastic because, you just take a piece of steel and you take a burnishing tool and you can literally just burnish it and you've got a tool, and you can scrape and have a lot of control depending on the shape of the tool and how much pressure you're applying. From a work perspective, I love scrapers. And then, an example of a hero tool that is, again, kind of falls not in the binky category because it hasn't been around long enough, but I was helping Joseph Lamour, the piano tech here at USD, change a broken string on the music school's 1971 Steinway D, and it was one of the really long unwound strings that goes underneath the bass strings. And getting that threaded through so that it wouldn't get twisted or over-under problems or whatever. And one day we were working on, tackling this, and we went out. There's a shop in town. It's the hardware store and sandwich shop and breakfast place. So it's got like literally the restaurant in the hardware store. It's got like the best candy selection you can possibly imagine. It's like somebody with hand skills. It's like paradise. What more can you want? Candy, food, tools, right? And so we go there in the morning, and I'm like, let's just go exploring to see if we can find something that will help with this, because we had heard about some tool somebody's using to thread the strings through, and we found a piece of plastic tubing And I didn't think there'd be anything like this there. It was a piece of plastic tubing that was just small enough that you could get it between the layers of strings. And it was like $3.50. It was also the right length to get it for the concert grand. And so we got this thing and we threaded the string through and it just worked like a miracle. It was like $3.50.
Oh my gosh.
And so hopefully it doesn't have to get used very often, but neither of us had done this type of repair before. So it's like, okay, we had some failed attempts where we tried something. It was like, no, we ran out of time or it wasn't going to work. But now we kind of feel like, okay, well, as long as we've got that tubing, we're good.
That's genius. For technicians who might want to try that, do you remember if there was a brand or like what the tubing was used for, or it's
just Ace Hardware? Go to the section where they sell different, I was thinking they'd have like more rubber tubing and then you worry about the string getting caught because it's kind of grippy.
Yeah.
But this was like a piece of plastic tubing of some sort.
Yeah. I picture almost like if you've worked with the damp chaser humidity systems, they have the hose that you put the water through. That's kind of what
Yeah, it's kind of that dimension, but maybe a little less grippy, and it stayed fairly straight. You may have to cut a shorter length of it if you're doing it on like a baby grand or something, but this was perfect for a concert grand. I do have to say, piano technicians, when I first started getting into the piano world, I'm like, you guys have the coolest tools. You've got nifty tools for everything. And
that's why I love asking that question. Yeah.
yeah, Dale Irwin was just posting a tool that he was having made that just pops the heads off from hammerheads off from shanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you need it, it's there.
Yeah. Oh my God. If we're talking tools, we could go forever. But Arian, you have been an amazing guest. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. And thank you to the piano world. I'm a newbie in this field. I've had the enthusiasm, I just hadn't delved in, and everybody has been so welcoming and so kind, and I really, really appreciate how receptive the piano world has been to somebody just coming in like the Kool-Aid man and being dorky and interested and, sometimes ignorant, but, doing my best.
One of us. You're one of us.
Yeah, if you're not confused, you haven't been involved in pianos long enough because there's a lot to be confused about.
When I was first starting, one of the other apprentices said, just go to all the things that you don't understand because it ends up being a fire hydrant and you can kind of just joyfully be drenched and not have to understand all of it, but it helps. It builds up. Yeah. Another thank you to Arian for joining us on the show. You can find the links to all the resources we discussed in the show notes for this episode. Additionally, Arian encourages any technicians attending this year's PTG convention in Des Moines to make the trek out to the museum and witness firsthand the magic of their collection. If you have any questions about historic instruments, you can also reach out to her at arian.sheets@usd.edu.